Quick question about Legendary. Did developers even have character designers in this era, or did they just model the first guy they could find off the street? As these stories are wont to go, Legendary opens with something going wrong and you're thrust into the shoes of Deckard, which I'm pretty sure is the name of at least 4 other FPS protagonists from 2008, but whatever. I have less of a problem with his name than how utterly forgettable he is, which isn't helped by the silent protagonist approach, which works well in something like Half-Life and Modern Warfare much better because you don't actually see your protagonist in cutscenes. In Legendary, however, you do. And it's incredibly awkward to watch this bargain bin Frank West mime his way through various situations. It's also never made clear in the beginning who or what Deckard is. Is he an art thief, a modern Indiana Jones type? It doesn't matter because once the story attempts to get off the ground, you will lose the plot faster than I lost my patience with this game. In fact, this might be the rare FPS that would have been better with a generic military man protagonist. You play as a character who's never officially inducted into any kind of armed service, but fight alongside them throughout. It takes you out of the experience a bit, to be honest, whereas simply playing as a regular dude bro COD knockoff fighting magical creatures would have been at least a fun Predator-like spin on genre tropes, thrusting familiar machismo badasses, and by extension the player, into a situation they're outgunned and unprepared for. I don't know, just an idea. The opening sequence is actually fairly polished, thrusting players down a long set-piece corridor that features dozens of NPCs getting yeeted by a giant skybeam, and culminates in a Manhattan street as giant griffins and concrete golems eat and kill everything in sight. With lots of models and explosions, it runs impressively well, with no frame rate dips in sight, and the set pieces themselves have a great sense of scale, giving the creatures a real sense of menace. It's the closest I've felt to playing a first-person kaiju game, and for that, I kinda love this opening sequence. And it's a solid setup for the basic premise of Legendary. What if we put magic fairy tale monsters into an otherwise standard first-person shooter? So I bet after some interesting enemies like fire frogs and then some teases like werewolves, giant golems, and griffins, you're going to fight some real cool stuff at the beginning of this game. Oh, no, actually the second group of enemies are just some dudes? Awesome. Interesting. So this Walmart brand Jericho squad makes up a little more than half of the enemy roster, and are always underwhelming and boring to fight in equal measure. Legendary suffers from Turok syndrome, where the devs had a great premise for an enemy roster, but couldn't help but insert generic, boring, faceless shooter goons to pit you against for much of the game's runtime. Legendary is made by Spark Unlimited, the same studio behind Turning Point Fall of Liberty, and honestly, you can totally tell. While the overall presentation is better, textures look a lot nicer, the frame rate is more consistent, the game still suffers from many of the deeper issues that plague Turning Point, including poor checkpointing and long load times which, like Turning Point, only exacerbate the issues present during gameplay. Legendary is also another dull gray-brown shooter of the Unreal Engine 3 variety, and though it takes place in a different time period from Turning Point, Legendary still takes place in New York, so I wonder if there's any reused assets. Not that that would be a bad thing, I'm mostly just curious. Despite the overall dull color tones, Legendary isn't half bad visually. The texture fidelity is better than Turning Point, like I mentioned. The game uses more green, red, and blue lighting highlights to add nice visual flair. God rays look great and help give some scenes a suitably gothic atmosphere. There are also some really beautiful particle effects that pop off all the time, and an impressive assortment of small destructible objects around the environment that add depth and detail to the otherwise empty rooms and hallways. These little bits of set dressing are the carefully crafted highlights of the experience, honestly. The same can't be said for the enemy roster. Enemies, like the aforementioned shooting bad guys, fire, frog things, and werewolves, are unfortunately little more than annoyances, substituting challenging gameplay caveats for swarming the player from every direction. On normal difficulty, they're rarely insurmountable, but I switched off of hard immediately due to frustration from the overwhelming enemy encounters combined with poor checkpoints and long load times. The game's controls don't do any favors to the overwhelming enemy encounters either, thanks to a sluggish turning speed that will see packs of werewolves run circle around you before you can even train your sights on them. The gunplay itself is sufficient. Like Turning Point, there's a weird weight to the gunplay that is mostly satisfying, but the aim-down sights take up way too much of the screen, and combined with the muzzle flash, it can be cumbersome to navigate the more frenetic firefights. The weapons do feel impactful, and there's even a pretty decent shotgun, though it's lacking in range. The throwable weapons, made up of Molotovs and frag grenades, are abysmal. It uses the hold down to throw farther approach, but the lowest range is just dropping it at your feet. What's the farthest range? No idea, I just kinda guessed and hoped for the best. Ah yes, I almost forgot that, like any other modern shooter, Legendary has a gimmick. Here being the Animus. In the beginning of the game, Deckard gets a nasty burn from Pandora's box that allows him to do all kinds of Bioshocky stuff. Or at least I think that's what the devs probably envisioned when making an FPS with magic powers in one hand and a gun in the other. In execution, you basically just use the energy to heal. The health system is basic and actually kind of unique, using the energy from defeated enemies to heal yourself. It takes a little long and may cause more than a few frustrating deaths while you wait for your energy to gather and then heal with it, but otherwise it's a fine system. When it comes to level design and game flow, Legendary is the undisputed king of the suspension of disbelief ruining waist-high or lower objects that the player can't jump over. One of the game's first puzzles involves lowering a bunch of crates to climb on some other crates. The problem is that those other crates are just 2 feet high, and if the player didn't have the most useless jump in the world, he could just climb them like a goddamn normal video game character. This design philosophy extends to every part of the environment. Legendary sections off its larger spaces into essentially corridors, using everything at its disposal. Looks like you're roaming a crowded city street? You're actually just in a hallway of cars. It's almost impressive if it weren't so unintuitive due to how hard it is to often read where you're supposed to be going the second the game lets you off the leash slightly. The navigation, in league with the puzzles the game makes you toil through, feel like less intentional parts of creating a flow for the player, and more like just haphazardly placing random obstacles in a player path with very little rhyme or reason aside from giving them more buttons to press. At least the game's developers give you the mercy of an omnipresent button for finding your next objective, keeping the dawdling to a minimum. Still, Legendary is full of little time-wasting things like this that just ultimately feel like padding. On that note, Legendary has maybe the worst hacking, lockpicking minigame ever. It can't really even be called a minigame because there's no mechanical depth to it. You just hold X until the door opens, but it takes several seconds each time, including when there are several doors to go through in a row. With no minigame, there's no reason it can't just be a button click, and at that point, it should just be removed entirely. It adds nothing to the experience except for wasting my time. It's also the same case with the myriad valve-turning moments throughout the game, which pop up so frequently they can't help but feel like padding. If you're wondering where the QuickTime events are, they're thankfully few and far between, surprisingly, and none so bold as to insta-kill you, so I can't really complain here. In fact, the struggling werewolf QuickTime event ends in a satisfying slow-motion headshot destroying the baddie's head, and I gotta say, it's pretty satisfying each time, which can be said for most of the monster headshots. Legendary shows so much promise, more than even Turning Point in both its premise and its execution. There are interesting ideas like battling a kraken-like creature in cramped New York sewers, or fighting pixie poltergeist-possessed soda machines that can shoot cans at you. There's also a Times Square battle against a massive monster, which I think the Ghostbusters game did better, but how weird is it that there are multiple games in that category from this era? Then there's the London sections later in the game, which take on a wonderfully classic Hollywood gothic horror feel, ditching the ill-suited military shooter vibes for moody atmosphere as you battle werewolves by moonlight as griffins circle in the skies overhead. These levels culminate in a truly technically impressive battle against a kraken tearing apart the UK Parliament. Moments like these really let the game itself shine, helping it to stand out from the pack where its otherwise humdrum enemy and weapon variety holds it back. Legendary could have been more. For a game with the concept of fighting magical monsters, you basically just fight werewolves, griffins, and goons. I would have loved to see a game go farther with the concept. What about fighting yokai, medusas, or even Ray Harryhausen-looking skeleton warriors? Any of these could fit perfectly. Something tells me that Legendary was concepted as a more ambitious game and had the almighty hammer of budget limitations descend upon it. Either way, it's still a rich premise for a first-person shooter and makes for an okay B-movie-like experience. In all, Legendary is fun to look at, but only fun to play about half of the time. It's much better than Turning Point, but still only barely an average game overall. I can recommend it for shooter completionists looking for something legitimately different, but I can't fully recommend playing it to the end, and your individual enjoyment will vary by how much you can deal with the frustrations in exchange for its slight magical charms. Prey is one of those classic games that I somehow never got to playing. A first-wave Xbox 360 shooter running on the same tech as Quake 4 and Doom 3. On that note, I find it so odd that the only games this engine was ever used to make were sci-fi horror shooters with Cronenbergian abominations, but honestly, I kinda love it. It's a vibe. A game that is famous for its opening, Prey really does live up to the hype, at least in this scene. For 2006, this opening mission is a masterclass in establishing narrative, tone, stakes, and characters. I can't think of anything else like it from this time, really. I'd also like to point out that if Prey came out today, it would probably be lambasted as woke for not only featuring an entirely Native American human cast, except for the white redneck you beat up in the tutorial, but also casting a First Nations actor for the role of Tommy. Honestly, the Native angle could have gone so poorly. So glad to say that this game treats First Peoples with a lot of respect, and seeing a AAA action game with a lead like this must have meant a lot to the people who made it, and I'm betting a lot of people who played it. I can't imagine what it would be like as an Indigenous person to see yourself represented in a video game like this, especially in a time period like 2005. Speaking of people who played it, there's just something special about early generations games. This half-in, half-out exploration of what new technology can do, with one foot in last-generation gameplay techniques, and Prey is definitely one of those games. I love to imagine what it must have felt like to come home with a copy and a brand new Xbox 360, how many college kids lost study hours to online Prey multiplayer, or how many high schoolers stayed up too late after getting a game like this for Christmas. I don't know, the Xbox 360 is a very nostalgic system for me, and putting a huge title like this behind me after so many years feels almost like losing a bit of that magic. If only because Prey is such a damn good game. After the initial scenes that start the game, which I don't want to spoil because I recommend going in blind if you can, Prey turns into a pretty by-the-numbers shooter, but with enough caveats to help it stand out and still be worth playing today. You get a basic assortment of weapons like assault rifles, acid shotguns, living grenades, and all of them fill out their specified role in an arsenal. Each weapon has an alternate fire, including grenade launchers, scopes, and more. The feedback throughout is pretty solid, and designs of the guns, combined with the solid sound design, really help make an otherwise humdrum arsenal feel uniquely alien. The designs themselves mesh bioorganic machinery with cold weaponry, but at the end of the day, they're your basic shooter implements. The exception is an elemental gun that can freeze enemies or even blast an incredibly satisfying power beam, among other powers depending on how it's charged from the environment. The enemies you encounter too are fairly run-of-the-mill, especially if you've played Quake 4 or Doom 3. The environments, like those games, feature plenty of claustrophobic hallways and tight spaces interspersed with segments of verticality. There's not a lot of variety, but just enough to not get too boring. The enemies are simple, taking cover and firing at you with reckless abandon. Unlike Doom 3, their variety rarely necessitates changing tactics. You can mostly just shoot at any enemy with whatever you have handy. So, if the enemies are nothing special and the weapons are a garden variety, what makes Prey so special then? Everything else. As you explore the massive mothership, you're treated to a variety of mind-bending puzzles and set pieces, all tailor-made to smoothly show off the power of the almighty Xbox 360. And even today, a lot of the tech like portals, shrinking, and playing with gravity is still impressive. It goes a long way towards keeping the game fresh across its roughly 15-hour runtime. The other half of Prey's appeal lies in the art direction. Like the aforementioned other id Tech games, Prey plays host to a menagerie of gross mechanical abominations and can sometimes feel like a haunted house ride with its use of set pieces. These moments of horror do a lot to help establish atmosphere and, again, help keep the game fresh and interesting, breaking up segments of shooting with slower-paced moments of tension. What other story there is slight throughout, which is actually a good thing. Prey takes the raid approach, putting a protagonist in a situation with an end goal and putting slight obstacles in their way that never distract too much. For a shooter, it works wonderfully. The game does manage to build an interesting world and expand on its own lore in subtle ways throughout, and little touches like radio broadcasts overheard throughout, hosted by real-world conspiracy broadcaster Art Bell, keep the game grounded in a tangible world. Despite the scant story development, the focus on a few characters and their motivations keeps the tension high. I don't want to spoil anything, but one late-game boss fight in particular is going to haunt me as one of the darkest and most emotional twists I've seen in a shooter ever. You really come to empathize and identify with Tommy and his struggle, and the game doesn't need elaborate cutscenes or award-baiting emotional moments to achieve that. Prey also features a interesting respawn mechanic. Throughout the game, Tommy uses a spirit-walking ability to solve puzzles and defeat enemies. When Tommy dies, however, this spirit goes back to the spirit world, where you kill these flying bat things to regain health and stamina before being respawned. It's kind of like the Vita Chambers in Bioshock, but with an extra minigame thrown in. On one hand, it takes a lot of the challenge out of harder encounters because you can kind of cheese through them if you're willing to sit through the spirit world a bunch. But on the other hand, it's another one of those time and place mechanics, where you can tell the team was trying to find alternate ways to approach standard shooter mechanics of the day, and for that I really respect the chutzpah. Other than that, Prey is a pretty slight game throughout. It's incredibly linear, there are some minor navigation issues in the larger areas, and I think it relies a bit too much on the first-person vehicle sections at times. There aren't any additional modes or collectibles to find, so not much in the way of replay value either. But as someone coming to it for the first time, it's absolutely worth a look for anyone interested in a cult classic that's still not like anything else out there. It's a fun, satisfying, and memorable romp through the early days of the Xbox 360, and deserves to be played by any self-respecting shooter fan, whether you're looking for a satisfying gameplay experience or a story that will stick with you when you've put the controller down. Alien vs. Predator is a game I've never understood the derision for. When I played it in high school, I completed each of the game's 3 campaigns several times over and had a reasonably good time doing so, as a fan of both Alien and Predator. It was fine to me, nothing overly special, but certainly not bad. But playing it now, it feels like such a breath of fresh air. Thanks to an abundance of love and passion for the respective franchises, and a gorgeous visual style, I'm glad to say that Alien vs. Predator is a wonderfully bit of cheesy blockbuster horror fun worth revisiting. As I previously mentioned, the game is divided into 3 campaigns between the Predators, Aliens, and the Colonial Marines. Each campaign has a unique point of view, starting with the young Predator on their first hunt, a rookie Marine looking to escape an alien outbreak, and an alien with a special bond to the Queen. Each campaign's POV puts you in the perspective of a new hire, so to speak, and then has you deal with the pressures that follow. I think the easiest way to dive into the campaigns is to talk about the environments first. As you traverse the alien world, Weyland-Yutani labs, and ancient ruins, you'll play through the same levels in each campaign, but with different orders and perspectives. For example, your first mission as Marine sees you in a dusty colony town that you don't see until the second Predator mission, where you go through the level basically backwards from your Marine counterpart. The environments are also designed to take advantage of each character's abilities. The Predator is set up to play with stealth, using long jumps, camouflage, and lures to take down groups of enemies. This means that there needs to be a lot of high vantage points and walkways. For the alien that can crawl on anything, there are plenty of tight hiding spaces and vents to crawl through. Even the ceiling becomes part of the level, allowing you to hide and attack from the shadows. The Marine gameplay plays out like a standard shooter, so not much to say there. The usage of environments and variety throughout, while taking into consideration each of these abilities, is impressive to say the least. This is truly a game where every asset got maximum bang for the team's buck. The downside is that, as a result, each campaign is only 3 to 4 hours long. However, they pack so much into those 3 hours that you probably won't even mind. The Predator campaign puts players in the shoes of the famous monster like no other game ever before. Switching vision modes, luring people with voice samples, using the shoulder cannon, and stalking and killing prey all feel wonderfully fleshed out, complete with all the iconic sound effects. The one big issue I have is the use of the shoulder buttons for melee attacks, when I feel the ability should be put there. But it's ultimately minor. Another issue for the Predator gameplay is the jumping mechanic, which sees you preparing for a long-range lunge with a shoulder button, but you can't always jump where you're aiming, which can lead to panicked moments, trying and occasionally failing to escape on harder difficulties. I will say that in melee skirmishes with xenomorphs, it's annoyingly easy to be overwhelmed, but I chalk that up to needing better planning before tackling a Predator's deadliest enemy, rather than actually a gameplay frustration. Overall, I think that the Predator can be clunky at first, but ultimately incredibly satisfying once you master your arsenal and abilities, making for the best Predator simulator you're gonna find in video games. The Marine campaign, for my money, is also one of the best alien-themed games you can play. The contrast between this game and Aliens Colonial Marines, which came out just a few years later, is night and day. You play as a rookie whose squad gets wiped out early on and must work together with your partner Tequila, this game's Vasquez stand-in who's doing her absolute best Michelle Rodriguez impression, to uncover the Weyland-Yutani conspiracy and escape the alien planet. It's simple, to the point, and allows for plenty of fan service and world building. The aliens here are vicious, quick, and blend into their surroundings. Even taking off their legs won't always stop them. Limited lighting and a paltry flashlight keep the tension high, and unlike Colonial Marines, each alien is a real threat. Getting cornered and not keeping distance is a quick ticket to death. Even if you manage to kill one, the acid blood also does heavy damage, and exploding one's head nearby is almost always an instant kill. While this can be annoying at first, it helps keep the horror high in what otherwise might be fairly ho-hum sci-fi shooter fluff. Another possibly annoying aspect is the facehuggers, but I found it more exhilarating than anything, searching the environment when you hear the telltale motion sensor, knowing that death could be quick and unseen if you don't find it first. As the most shootery aspect of the game, there are other tidbits to talk about with the Marine. The gun selection is basic, though effective, with the pulse rifle being the clear standout. You also get to play with a solid double-barrel shotgun, a classic smart gun that is incredibly underutilized, though satisfying, and a flamethrower. The flamethrower is fun to use, but feels underpowered against Xenos, which I count as a mark against it. Your mini-map is the motion tracker, so you'll be hearing plenty of that sound throughout. You do eventually fight some Weyland-Yutani robots, because of course you can't just have an Aliens game where you just shoot aliens. But for a 3-4 hour roller coaster ride through the Aliens Predator universe, it's one of the best out there, standing tall with the likes of Alien Isolation in its best moments. Then there's the Alien campaign. While I love the game's wall-crawling mechanic, the Alien's speed can lead to navigation issues. It's also, by necessity, the least narratively involving. You play as an alien test subject that escapes and runs some errands for your psychically linked queen. It's genuinely fun to strike from the shadows and terrorize civilians and Marines alike, occasionally even harvesting the terrorized humans to create more drones. But it also feels like a missed opportunity. This game has a Pred alien in it, but you never get to play as it. What? It's a bummer. Additionally, the lack of upgrades and weapon variety means that this campaign inherently has the least variety of the three. I would have liked to see more gameplay development, maybe the ability to command other drones or deploy facehuggers, but honestly the campaign is so thin and quick, it might have not even worked out to have added more variety. Still, it's a bloody good time to roleplay as a xenomorph stalking your prey from ceilings and walls and retreating to the shadows after every gory kill. To me, this campaign is also a must-play for any Alien fan. While the campaigns are all good, the game's graphics and presentation I think is where it shines the most. As I mentioned, you have all the movie-accurate sounds you could want, but more than that, the game is a visual feast. Each campaign has an entirely unique in-world UI that helps immerse the players. The world you explore, despite fairly regular locations like mines, military complexes, and ancient ruins, are brought to life wonderfully. There's amazing detail in nearly every texture, and a bevy of lighting, smoke, and particle effects help sell the atmosphere and, more importantly, the fear of this unforgiving and dangerous world. The lighting in particular, whether it's the god rays from an overcast sky or the scant guide lights in industrial ruins, keep the game's atmosphere rich through each campaign. This is also one of the few perpetually dark games that visually holds up because of how well light and dark are used in service of the game's art style. I was amazed to see how well this game held up, honestly. It's gorgeous and will definitely stand out as a visual gem in this generation for me going forward. While some of the animations themselves might not hold up, overall, AVP is still an impressive visual package. The amount of animations the aliens have is truly impressive, as is the variety of stealth kills available to both Predator and Alien. I remember this game being incredibly violent when I played it as a youth, and it still managed to be shocking today. But it's all in service of homage to the respective series the game is drawing inspiration from. Over the years, I've heard AVP referred to as a disappointment. That may be, especially for the multiplayer mode. I've never played it, but I know the original 90s PC titles are venerated in their time for their multiplayer. But for my money, AVP's 3 campaigns are some of the best Alien and Predator content in gaming, and provide a brief, bloody, and fun blockbuster experience that no fan of either series should miss. And that does it for my latest shooter ranking series. Thank you everybody for watching. I know it's been a little bit of time since my last video. I wanted to put this one out because I am preparing my Halloween first-person shooter video, and also Silent Hill Homecoming, the long-awaited documentary on my channel. After that, I have some designs on what I want to do next, but I'm keeping those close to the vest. So in the meantime, if you would like to help me continue my work, or if you have any suggestions, leave them in the comment below for games I should play for this series, and consider giving a couple dollars to my Patreon and checking out my other videos. Any support and help is always appreciated. Thank you, and I will see you next time.